Hello my fiery friends, the Infernoman here with the hottest in budget deck technology. And for today's deck tech, join me once again as we continue to make our way through the Basically series. For those that don't know, this is a series of decks I've put together that will not require you to use a single rare or mythic to build.
Neat!
That's right, so without further ado, join me today in the Brawl format for another ultra budget deck, a deck that I'm calling, basically, Syr Konrad. But before we continue, if you do like any of the content that I do, please like, follow, and subscribe wherever you watch the content. You can support me monthly for a small amount on Patreon, where I have all of my extended bonus footage posted. We also have a Redbubble spot where you can buy merch like stickers and shirts, or for free, all you can just do also is just join our growing community on Discord. Your support helps keep this channel going. All links are in the details below. Longtime viewers of the channel know how we do it. We have to talk about the stats of the deck before we dive right in. So our basically Syr Konrad deck is an all mono black build. We're looking at an average mana curve about 2.2, and we'll be rocking a total of 33 creatures in the deck, with 7 instants, 10 sorceries, 5 artifacts, 10 enchantments, and 37 lands. Our mono black build today is going to be a grindy mid-range deck that is going to try to focus actually more on the slow incremental bonus of life gain and drain, by getting some creatures to go into the graveyard, out of the graveyard, milling whatever we can do to eventually close out the game and hopefully just beat our opponent with the extra value this deck can provide. But you may be asking yourself right now, is it possible to breathe new life into Syr Konrad The Grim on an ultra budget, this time without using any rares or mythics?
Good question!
Well, I'm glad you asked, so let's not waste any more time and let's explain to you how today's deck works. To begin, let's cover of course our commander in the deck, and of course as I just mentioned, it'll be Syr Konrad The Grim. So if you haven't seen this card before, Syr Konrad The Grim is a 5 mana, 5/4 legendary creature, human knight that reads, whenever another creature dies, or creature card is put into the graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or creature card leaves your graveyard, Syr Konrad will deal 1 damage to each opponent, and for 2 mana, you can mill a single card. So, as it pretty much just states, we're just trying to get a bunch of cards in and out of the graveyard as much as possible to hopefully outgrind our opponent and score our victory utilizing that ability. Alright, now before we get started, as always, you might want to settle on in everyone because it always takes me a while to get through an entire Brawl deck. And so we begin, of course, with our first category, which is going to be all of our sack fodder and sack enablers. With the 1-drop slide here, we'll have Cult Conscript. This, of course, is a skeleton warrior. 2/1 enters tapped. However, we can bring it back from the graveyard to the battlefield as long as a non-skeleton creature died under our control this turn. Fairy Dream Thief enters and allows us to surveil 1, but once it's in the graveyard, we can exile it for 3 mana to help us draw a card, but we will, of course, lose 1 life. Forsaken Miner here is another skeleton rogue. While it can't block, if we do commit a crime, i.e. if we target anything our opponent is doing, we can then simply pay 1 and then bring the card back from the graveyard to the battlefield. Foulmire Knight here is a 1/1 death toucher, so it's a great chump blocker, but of course we can also use its instant adventure side to draw a card. However, we will still lose 1 life. One of our better sacrifice enablers here is going to be Greedy Freeboater here. If it dies, scry 1 and create a treasure token for some ramp. Persistent Specimen, same thing just as our other skeletons, which is 3 mana, brings it back from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. If Shambling Gas dies, you can either make a treasure token, which is 9 times out of 10 what you want, or give a target creature an opponent controls -1/-1. Citrus Supplier is one of our better cards here because when it dies, or if it enters, just simply mill 3 cards to help get our graveyard shenanigans going. Valgavoth's Faithful here can be sacrificed to then bring back a creature card from the graveyard to the battlefield. You ideally want to try to hit something that's bigger for a much cheaper cost. Witch's Oven here is actually a great way to sacrifice anything at instant speed because it costs us absolutely nothing, and then we can make a food token, which of course can trigger other abilities that we will talk about later in the deck. Accursed Marauder here, when it enters, each player has to sacrifice a non-token creature, so it's a great edict effect, but it will trigger off our abilities and still keep our game plan going. Deadly Dispute allows us, of course, to draw a couple extra cards, creates a treasure token for us at the cost of course, sacrificing an artifact or a creature. Reassembling Skeleton, one of the classics when it comes to a card that just sack fodder here, just pay 2 mana to bring it back from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped at instant speed. Undead Butler here, when it enters, mill 3 cards, however, when we want it to die, we can then exile it, so then we can, of course, bring back a creature card from our graveyard back to our hand. Grave Lighter here is similar to the Accursed Marauder here. When it enters, draw a card if a creature died this turn. Otherwise, we have to sacrifice a creature of our choice. And of course, this goes for also our opponent. Infernal Vessel here, if it dies at least once and it wasn't a demon, it can come back to the battlefield under our control as a demon with also a 2+1/+1 counters on it, so it comes back even stronger than it currently is. Silver Smoke Ghoul here can be sacrificed on its own at instant speed to draw a card. However, if we gain 3 life at the end of our turn, we can bring it back from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Skullport Merchant here enters and creates for us a treasure token. However, we can also sacrifice a treasure or another creature to draw a card. And then finally, in the 5-drop, we'll have Young Necromancer here. When she enters, you can exile 2 cards from a graveyard, and if we do, bring back another creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. Moving on to the next category of cards, that'll be all of our life gain and drain spells. Starting in the 1-drop slot here, we'll have Cauldron Familiar. I'm pretty sure I don't have to explain this card, but of course, when it enters, make an opponent lose 1 life, and we will gain 1 life. This is also the reason why, of course, we're using the Witch's Oven as course, so you can use this as our usual Cat Oven combo, which works very well for our game plan. Cling to Dust here is going to be one of our graveyard hate cards. You can exile a card from a graveyard, and if it was a creature card, gain 3 life, and we can otherwise draw a card if it's any other card type. Keep in mind, of course, it doesn't have to be, of course, an opponent's card. It can also be one of our cards to help kind of trigger off Syr Konrad and the rest of our game plan. Fester Leech here, we're not all in on the mill game plan here, but it does help us out a little bit here. As long as it deals combat damage to a player, mill 2 cards. Pump it up for 2 extra mana to give it a +2/+2 pump for once each turn. Snarling Gorehound here, it has Menace. It's a little dog that will, of course, when another creature enters with power 2 or less, Surveil 1. So again, it just helps us fill up our graveyard with other stuff. Warlock class here also is going to be a bit of a slow burn here, but at the beginning of our end step, if a creature died this turn, make an opponent lose life. At level 2, we can then look at the top 3 cards of our library, put 1 into our hand, and the rest into our graveyard. And then, of course, at level 3, at the beginning of an opponent's end step, they will lose life equal to the amount of damage they've taken this turn. Blood Artist here, a classic, of course, that we really want for this deck here. Anytime another creature dies, whether it's ours or our opponent's, they will lose 1 life, and we will gain 1 life. Cynical Loner here, if this card is tapped at our second main phase, we can then dig into our deck to then search for a card and throw it immediately into the graveyard. So this is great for us to kind of start filling up our graveyard with more cards. Ghoulish Procession here, anytime we will have a creature die, we create a token. Although, of course, the token has decayed, so that means it will die on its own. That's perfectly fine for us because it will still trigger off our game plan. Zulaport Cutthroat here, similar, of course, to the Blood Artist here. Anytime a creature, of course, on our side, however, dies, we can then make an opponent lose 1 life and gain 1 life. Tyramat, Chosen from Death here, although it doesn't really help us per se with everything we're doing, it just helps us, of course, with more graveyard shenanigans here because it exiles some more cards to gain some life, and of course this will help us with Syr Konrad do its thing. Bastard Remembrance here, another great staple for us. Anytime a creature we control dies, we make an opponent lose 1 life and gain 1 life. Also, it enters with a Human Soldier creature token, which is great for us to at least do some chump blocking at any point in the game. Bantu's Monument is also another one of our all-star cards here. This legendary artifact allows us to make all of our black creature spells cast for 1 less. And anytime we cast a creature spell, an opponent will lose 1 life and we gain 1 life.
That is awesome!
Mind Rack Harpy here in the 4-drop slot here is a flying harpy. It's a 3/2, and at the beginning of combat on our turn, we can mill 3 cards. So this helps us kind of do a small little bit of a mill engine for us and the mid part of the game. Also in the 4-drop slot here, we'll also have Death Priest of Merkel here, a 4-drop 3/3, a Tiefling Cleric. All of our skeletons, vampires, and zombies we control get another extra +1/+1 pump, so it's great for aggro purposes. However, at the beginning of our end step, if a creature died this turn, we get to create a skeleton creature token. So this is great for us again to keep our graveyard going. We can of course trigger off other things and help us go with a more aggro plan. Grey Merchant of Asphodel here, good old Gary here is great for us because this is probably one of our biggest game enders for us. As long as we have a ton of Black Devotion, we can then drain our opponent for a ton and gain a ton of life back. And then finally here in the 6-drop slot, we'll have Dreadhound. This demon dog here is a 6/6, and when it enters, mill 3 cards. Anytime a creature dies or a creature card is put into the graveyard from the library, we can drain our opponent for 1 life. Our next category cards moving on to will be, of course, all the stuff that helps us just bring stuff back from the graveyard to our hand or to the battlefield. Starting in the 1-drop slot, we'll have Feign Death here. At instant speed, if a creature dies, we can bring it back from the graveyard tapped under our control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Kaya's Ghost form is actually going to be the best one we want to have with Syr Konrad here because whether it dies or if it gets exiled, we can just simply bring it back to the battlefield under our control. Not Dead After All is basically similar to Feign Death. Instead of however getting a +1/+1 counter on the card, instead we will get a Wicked Creature token, which kind of still gives us a +1/+1 pump anyway. However, if that token does disappear off the battlefield, we can make our opponent lose 1 life. Vata Rebirth is more of a slow burn for our deck, but it's still great for us. Anytime a creature or artifact we control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on this artifact. We can then later on remove 4 oil counters from it and then bring back a creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. Although it's only at sorcery speed, this is repeatable. Cemetery Recruitment here, we can bring back a creature card from our graveyard to our hand. If it's a zombie card, we get to draw a card. Eternal Taskmaster here is a little more on the expensive side, so this 2-mana 2/3 zombie, if it attacks, you can pay 3, and if you do, bring back a creature card from our graveyard to our hand. Order of Midnight here, while as a human flying knight, it cannot block, we want the sorcery side, which is for 2 mana, bring back a creature card from our graveyard to our hand. Back for seconds here can bring back up to 2 creature cards from our graveyard to the hand. However, if we bargain the spell by sacrificing an artifact, enchantment, or token, we can bring back a card with a mana value of 4 or less onto the battlefield, and the other card goes into our hand.
You had my curiosity, but now you have my attention.
Our other recursion spell will be Call of the Death Dweller here. For a total mana value of 3 or less, we can bring back 2 creature cards from our graveyard to the battlefield. You get to put 1 menace counter on one of them and a death touch counter on the other. Blood for Bones here in the 4-drop is also a slow sorcery speed, and we have to sacrifice another creature, but that's actually perfectly fine for our deck. By doing so, we can bring back a creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. And then finally, in the 5-drop slot here, Summon Undead, which is perfect for our deck. Mill 3 cards, and then bring back a creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. Our next category of cards will focus on, again, spot removal and some small wrathing for our deck to keep control of the board. We'll have Annihilating Glare, we'll have Bloodsheath's Thirst, Bone Shards, and Eaten Alive, Fatal Push, and Feed the Swarm. Pretty much all these cards all do the same thing, where they all just kind of are spot removal in different ways. Fell the Profane here will be our last of the spot removal cards here, but this of course has helped us out because it can also be a land in a pinch, but we can also destroy instant speed, a creature, or a planeswalker. Nightclubber here and Archfiend of Sorrows are kind of the same thing here. They're small little wraths here, but they are very helpful for our deck. With Archfiend of Sorrows, it gives all of our creatures and opponent controls -2/-2 until end of turn, and you can unearth it for 5 mana to then bring it back one more time. Nightclubber, however, is a little bit different on this end. It's only going to give our opponent's creatures -1/-1 until end of turn, or you can blitz it in for the same cost of 3 mana if you do need something at hasty or speed, and then to sacrifice it to then trigger off everything else our deck is trying to do. And then we'll circle back over to, finally, the Eldritch Reborn, one of our few edicts in the deck where we make our opponent sacrifice a creature or planeswalker of their choosing, make them discard a card, and then finally put a creature card or a planeswalker card from any graveyard under the battlefield under our control. As far as other general utilities that can just help our game plan go off a little bit easier here, we'll utilize a little bit of card draw and a little bit of exiling effects for our deck. Graft Harvest here gives all of our zombies menace, but for 4 mana we can exile a creature card from our graveyard to make a 2/2 black zombie creature token. We'll also utilize Bandit's Talent here. While we're again not focusing on a discard plan, it helps us again out in the late game. We can then trigger it to level 2 to then make sure that our opponent will lose 2 life if they have 1 or fewer cards in hand. And at level 3, at the beginning of our draw step, we can draw an additional card if an opponent has fewer than 1 or more cards in hand. Zombie Infestation here allows us to just discard some cards from our hand here to create some more zombie creature tokens, which again can enable things like Graft Harvest and other cards that exile effects from our graveyard. Swiftfoot Boots here is going to be mostly a staple just to give Syr Konrad here some protection because it is expensive. We want to make sure he doesn't have to be recasted multiple times from the command zone. Bogger Trawler here is actually one of our secret techs here to then destroy our opponent. So hear me out for a second here. While you can use this as a creature to then exile an opponent's graveyard, notice of course the wording does say on here, exile target player's graveyard. So what you can do of course is you can exile your own graveyard with this card, and usually you should be able to drain out your opponent very quickly.
That's a surprise tool that can help us later.
And then finally, in the 3-drop slot here at instant speed, you can then play also Rowan's Grim Search. You then of course draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. However, if you bargain it, you can then look at the top 4 cards of your library, then pick 2 of those cards to put back on the top, put the other 2 into the graveyard, and then draw the 2 cards and lose 2 life. So this is a great way to kind of fix your next set of draws and also get a bunch of stuff into the graveyard to again trigger off your whole game plan. As far as your mana base is concerned, we'll just work with what we got and on budget here, so that means we'll be utilizing Buried Moor. Cycle this if you don't need it, but also it just enters tapped as a basic land. Bajuka Bog here is another additional way we can exile a graveyard here, and thankfully it can also be ours, so we can still trigger off things with our shenanigans if we want to. 29 Swamps, of course, is our basics. A Vault of Whispers for an artifact land. You can use this as sacrifice for other things we need to later on in the game. A Witch's Cottage here. As long as we control 3 or more swamps, we can then put a creature card back from our graveyard on top of our library. Amonkhet Raceway here. Same thing, it doesn't really synergize with the deck, but sometimes we might want to give a creature haste to then go ahead and kind of close out the game if we need to do a big swing. Arid Archway here, it's going to be slow, it will bounce back one of our lands, but then once it does stay on the battlefield, we can then tap it for 2. And then for our non-basic land hate against our opponents here, we'll round it out with Demolition Field and Volatile Fall to destroy those things. Volatile Fall will give us a treasure token. Demolition Field, however, will also give us a basic to dig out of our deck. Now, in terms of tips and tricks I can give you to get the most value out of the deck, here's what it's going to be breaking down to. In the early part of the game, throw out there all of your sack fodder. We're talking about your Forsaken Miners, your Cult Conscripts, all of your skeletons that of course you can bring back. Those are going to be great early game threats. Even though they don't do much damage on their own, accumulate enough of them and your opponent is going to have to find a way to react to them. And even if they do get blown up, you have plenty of ways to keep bringing them back, tormenting your opponent as you keep accumulating more and more resources to build up your game plan. Once you get to the mid part of the game, that's actually where you're going to really start taking advantage of the sack abilities, but also depends on what your opponent is throwing out there. And when you get to the late part of the game, this is of course when you're going to want to hold on to those other cards that can help recur things over and over again. Your young necromancers, Grey Merchant of Asphodels, and some of your bigger threats that can then summon other creatures from either your own graveyard or your opponent's graveyard and then turn the tables to then hopefully close out the game and defeat your opponents. One of the biggest advantages that our deck has versus some of the other decks is we actually don't care again if some of our cards do get destroyed along the way. We have tons of spot removal for the deck, so if you have to sacrifice some of your creatures just to get extra treasures out, or just again to get rid of a creature, you have plenty of ways of getting value out of almost every single one of your creatures that you put out there. The 1 and 2 drops are going to be the most important pieces to keep them recurring, and some of your creatures you actually do want to get blown up, so that way you can then recur them, or they'll trigger off other abilities such as your life gain and drain creatures. Having said that, make sure again to try to be mindful as to what spot removal you use at what given time. While we do have several things that are instant speed, we also have some slower things that are also going to be helpful just as well. Sometimes you may have to use your fatal push ahead of sometimes using something like, say your Bloodchief's Thirst, but if you anticipate your opponent is going to put out something that's bigger or more threatening, you might want to hold on to some of your more flexible removal to take care of other things. So this might mean that there might be some awkward turns you have, but again, this will come with practice once you start figuring out how to properly sequence your removal. Another one of the biggest advantages because of this, we can actually be super flexible with how we handle our opponent. You can be super aggressive and put a lot of pressure on your opponents to make sure they have to answer your threats, or you can be very defensive and wait until they start swinging to then chump block over and over again to drive your opponent crazy. And our other biggest advantage with this deck is because of how flexible it is, you can hold on to as much spot removal as you need to, and you have more than enough to handle pretty much any of the major threats that some of your smaller creatures might have trouble dealing with. While at the same time, you can also again just keep draining out your opponent and dirtle around until they have no choice but to either swing and trigger off abilities, or sometimes you can just finish off your opponent with something such as your Grey Merchant to then hopefully drain them out in one fell swoop. But of course, even with a flexible deck like ours, we do of course run into several weaknesses that I need to address. One of the biggest weaknesses to our deck is, while we have plenty of spot removal to handle pretty much any type of creature or anything out there, because we're mono black, we're very weak to artifact heavy decks. Thankfully, of course, we do have answers for even enchantments, but they're few and far between. So if your opponent is very controlling with a lot of artifacts, you're going to have to focus a lot more on staying aggressive as possible just to stay ahead of their curve. Speaking of trying to stay ahead of the curve, your other major weakness for the deck is, while we have plenty of ways of recurring a lot of our threats, the biggest thing that we have to keep in mind is if your opponent has a lot of exiling effects specifically, that's where your good deck is going to feel very sad. While we don't usually care that our opponent will try to destroy our creatures and blow them up, we have plenty of ways of bringing them back, but with exile effects, they're gone forever, and there's no way we can even trigger off some of our things if our opponent keeps exiling our creatures. And of course, that does lead us to the final major weakness to the deck is, while I did mention earlier we have plenty of ways of dealing with threats individually, our deck usually has a lot of hard time dealing with bigger creatures if we go wide. Because we're on such a small budget, you notice that, as we mentioned earlier, our wraths are kind of on the small side, so we kind of have to just chump block for days and hope that our opponent doesn't overwhelm us with value, such as creatures that have trample, or just bigger threats before we have an answer to life gain and drain them. But with all that said, if you're still a fan overall of what we showed off today, and if you're interested in seeing what else you can do with mono black or sacrifice in general, as always, I will show you on screen right now a couple of quick little snapshots of other deck techs we have done over the course of this channel. And if you haven't noticed already, those links have been scattered throughout the course of this video. So be sure to click on one of those if you're interested in seeing what else you can do with this deck archetype. But with that all out of the way, here are my final thoughts that I can give you on today's deck. When it comes to all of the colors in Magic, I would probably say mono black is going to be the most versatile color, and you can see today when we showed off today's deck tech that it is capable of being super aggro, it can be super grindy, and also it can be a little bit even controlling when it needs to be. So to put this another way, if you're a fan of mid-range decks, if you're a fan of life gain and drain strategies, and if you're a fan of a deck that is capable of just going the distance and outdoing your opponent, then I would definitely say give this deck a try, and I assure you, when you manage to drain out your opponent, whether you're using your commander or any of your other support pieces, you're going to have a lot of fun doing so, and you'll be very surprised at how you can pull it off on today's budget of no rares or mythics. And when you manage to pull off that victory, whether again it's a life gain and drain, or you just manage to sacrifice a ton of stuff for value, I assure you, you will definitely not be disappointed. That's all I have for you today. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and just remember that no matter what you do play in the game of life, always be sure to burn bright. Later.